Hello, everybody. I'm going to be doing a book review right now. I'm going to be reviewing Mao II by Don Delillo, which is in this a Library of America edition. And there's two novels in this edition, Mao II and Underworld. But today I'll be talking about Mao II, which was published in 1991, I believe. And just to give a little brief plot synopsis. So the novel is about Bill Gray, who is a reclusive writer who decades ago wrote some influential novels, I assume in the 1950s, 1960s, but he's been out of the public eye for a long time. He lives with two people. There is Scott, who is basically his assistant and kind of a sycophant who fell in with Bill and manages his affairs. And then there's also Karen, who also helps Bill with his work, sort of takes care of the house, kind of the upkeep of the house. And a little bit of Karen's backstory. She was also part of the Unification Church, okay, which is a group started by the famous Reverend Moon in South Korea, and a church that's gained some admirers in the United States. And the novel actually begins with a mass wedding at Yankee Stadium in 1982, where couples gathered together, and it's a big set piece that starts out the novel of this mass wedding, okay, as a way of building the church, which is this very surreal event that DeLillo begins the novel with, okay. So with the plot, we know that Bill has been working on a novel for a long time, and it's almost ready to publish, apparently, but he is still reluctant to turn in the novel to his publisher. Meanwhile, there's this other plot with a hostage situation in Beirut, and in the 1980s, Beirut in Lebanon was a place rife with conflict in the 1980s, and there's a hostage there, a young poet, a Swiss poet, I believe, who is being held captive, and Bill is approached by a friend of his, an old friend of his in the publishing industry, to put out a statement for the release of this poet. He wants Bill to possibly as a way to bring Bill back into the public eye, but also a way for a literary figure to make a difference in real world affairs. Okay, and that's a big theme in this book too, of what is the place of literature, what is the place of a writer in this increasingly globalized world, and have more to say about that. So I will get into spoilers too. I should mention that. So eventually Bill decides to go ahead with this, and what follows is really a bunch of misadventures. Really nothing seems to go right. Initially they go to London, making the statement there, but there's a bombing near them, so that doesn't work out, and Bill kind of goes off on his own at some point, where he spends some time in Cyprus, and he eventually ends up in Beirut. But not to reveal too much, Bill kind of messes things up badly with the situation. Well, not necessarily messes things up. He just becomes very irresponsible and gets himself very, very sick, basically, is what happens. And this whole elaborate scheme to try to free the hostage really comes to nothing, really. So that's really the plot in a nutshell of what happens in the book, and I'll talk about some other things that happen as well. So one of the big themes in this book. I wrote down this is very much an end of history book, since it's written in this time, early 1990s, the end of the Cold War, when there was a lot of, on the one hand, euphoria about the Cold War coming to an end, the collapse of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, there was a lot of anxiety about what the new post-Cold War world was going to look like. And clearly Delillo is presenting a very grim image of what the post-Cold War world will look like. And in some ways, in many ways, it's a prophetic novel as far as what Delillo is dealing with in his themes. And there is this whole theme in the book of crowds, that the future will no longer belong to individuals. Okay, if anything, the 20th century, you could argue the Second World War was a war fought ultimately for individual rights, that, the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom from fear, things like that. And perhaps in an idealistic way, we think of the 20th century as one that championed individualism, but Delillo sees that shifting in the novel, where it's that opening scene with the mass wedding, that it's not so much about individuals making their own decisions in the future and kind of going their own way, which is what the life of a writer is, if anything, the author is an individualist who believes, in that their art is singular and everything like that. But Delillo sees it going a different way, and he draws a lot of contrast in the book between literature, art and literature, and terrorism, and that really acts of terrorism are starting to have more influence on the inner consciousness of people than art. Okay, and Delillo alludes to in the book, like 24-hour news cycle, like the never-ending stream of bad news. Of course, today that is amped up 1,000 times with social media and doom scrolling, but it seems like it's almost anticipating social media in a way, where a never-ending stream of bad news, negative information will begin to shape the way everyone perceives the world. Okay, so that's a pretty heavy theme, but that's running through it quite a bit. Now I'll just read one brief passage from the novel right here, which kind of gets into that a little bit. This is Bill in conversation with another writer character, and the writer says, "For some time now, I've had the feeling that novelists and terrorists are playing a zero-sum game." And Bill says, "Interesting, how so?" "What terrorists gain, novelists lose. The degree to which they influence mass consciousness is the extent of our decline as shapers of sensibility and thought. The danger they represent equals our failure to be dangerous. So, and the more clearly we see terror, the less impact we feel from art." So it's fear and terrorism appear to be the more driving forces in this world than art. Okay, and that's one of the ideas definitely running through the book. And the title itself, Mao II, which is a reference to an Andy Warhol print of Mao Zedong, and Mao is sort of, Delillo seems to view Mao as a harbinger of the future, where one person is able to harness the masses to their will, right? And like the success of the revolution in China, and then Mao's continuing hold over the people in China. Like one example Delillo talks about is Mao several times in his life convinced his followers that he had died, and then of course he would miraculously come back to life. So that whole idea of resurrection, but other people too, like Reverend Moon, the leader of the Unification Church, like kind of getting people to give up their individuality. And we find this with a lot of cults where it's about submission to what the leader thinks, the leader as this sort of exemplar of the people's will. So it's and that's where Delillo seems to see things going. And there's also references in the book to like the Ayatollah Khomeini. There's a long set piece of the Ayatollah's funeral and the chaos that ensued. And I'm trying to think if there's some other leaders of the moment he's mentioned, but yeah. So he's he's thinking about commitment to causes and the way artists, writers commit to a cause, and the way a terrorist might commit to their cause, and seeing a lot of similarities there. So that's one of the main ideas in the book. There's also I think this is not a big thing, but sort of like the idea of the reclusive artist, and Bill as a character is in some ways a frustrating character because we never necessarily learn about what he actually wrote about, which I think was an interesting choice, like what his novels were actually about or what kind of impact they even had on people. So I don't know if this is Delillo thinking about reclusive authors. Like clearly J.D. Salinger comes to mind, or I almost get the sense where Delillo seems to be saying, does Bill really have anything left to say? Does he? He has this unfinished novel that he's rewritten hundreds of times, and it does make you wonder where is he really going? So that whole idea, the mystique of the reclusive author. I mean, Thomas Pynchon, another example, but he's the counterexample because Pynchon has continued to publish novels, throughout his long career. He has one coming out this year. So I think along the lines of someone like Salinger, but anyway, that might just be me projecting there. I think some other interesting characters. Brita, I think is how you pronounce it. She is a photographer who photographs Bill at the start of the book, and she's going to be part of Bill kind of coming back into the public scene. So we spend time with Brita, and she travels around and she photographs writers. Although by the end of the book, she's returned to being a photojournalist, and she ends up in Beirut as well. She is following, guerrillas around and, doing, documenting that type of thing. And then Karen's an interesting character too, where there's, as I mentioned before, her backstory, she joined the Unification Church, and there's this really harrowing chapter where she's put through this deprogramming procedure where her parents track her down, and of course there's people that do this, who try to through some very aggressive verbal abuse try to get Karen out of the church, and then she manages to escape, and through a series of events she kind of ends up with Bill. But later in the book she ends up in New York City, and we're sort of led to believe that she's not really necessarily part of the cult anymore, but as soon as she's out in the city she starts to proselytize right away. So it's kind of a little terrifying. She's among the homeless population is in New York. She almost becomes this Christ-like figure for a while, where she is quoting all these dictums of the church, and she's feeding people and helping people. So her character arc is interesting in the book, but unsettling on some levels as well. So a lot of great moments, a lot of harrowing chapters. Really, the book is structured in a way where the first third is more of a character study, I would say. The middle becomes more of a political thriller. And then the last part becomes almost, it is an anticlimactic book. It does have this anticlimactic feel to it where nothing really seems to change really in the last part of the book. Reminded me of Graham Greene or even Joseph Conrad a little bit with, the book gets a little philosophical towards the end with its thesis, Delillo's thoughts on politics and mass consciousness and what the role of literature is in the 21st century, and what the place of art will be in the future. So it's a heavy novel with some heavy questions, but it's really written well. It's written with Delillo's really pristine prose that just leaps off the page, and so that's fantastic. Like I said, though, it does get a little bit anticlimactic towards the end, but I feel like that was it's designed that way, and I almost kind of respected the book for moving in that direction. So anyway, I guess that's pretty much all I have to say about Mao II. If there's anything else I wanted to mention, but I guess I found this novel very relevant. If you look at the course of politics in America in the past 10, 15 years, and really all over the world, I think you'll see some of the things DeLillo is pointing out here are quite relevant for the 2020s, even though this book is 30 years old now. So anyway, that's my review of Mao II by Don DeLillo. Underworld's on here next. I started Underworld, and that's a much longer book, but I do want to get through Underworld and also put out a review on that novel as well. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.